All right, we're here. Twitch.tv/110sports, 110sportsmedia.com/live. Thank you so much for joining us on a Monday. Josh Doring is back. Chris Brown is here with me, both in the correct boxes on the screen, I might add. It's a Monday, gentlemen. How you doing here at the beginning of the week?
Can't complain.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're getting to that time of year where it's all eyes on NCAA tournament, bubble, conference championships, all that good stuff. So can't help but be excited.
It was a good weekend for that too. And we're really getting to the point. We're going to hop into this in the first segment quite a bit. We're getting to the point where the national title conversation and the teams that can win it, apart from maybe, Gonzaga hasn't done anything to make anybody think that they're not at the top of the sport, but pretty much every time Michigan steps on the floor, they look even closer and closer to that elite group. And overreacting to a Baylor loss and saying that they've taken a step back is probably not fair to Baylor, but at the same time was almost getting to the point where I wasn't feeling like Baylor was going to lose either. And if you get through the Big 12 schedule this year without losing, you're just absolutely ridiculous. And instead, we're talking about a Michigan team who is now getting through the Big 10 schedule in a way that we didn't think anybody would get through the Big 10 schedule. And so the conversation at the top of the sport, every time those teams step on the floor, is getting more and more interesting to talk about as we get closer to the tournament, which makes the next couple weeks conference tournament selection Sundays even more exciting. Speaking of national title contenders, we're going to do our top 5 national title contenders. 3 of them, I would argue, are pretty easy.
Yep.
But the next 2, I wouldn't be surprised if there's some variance there, because I think, if nothing else, there's a pretty big gap between whoever is whoever you might have at number 3 and who number 4 is. So hopefully get some variance there. We'll do winners and losers at the end, as we do every Monday. But talking about the Michigan Wolverines, the Baylor Bears look human to the extent that it results in a loss for the first time this year. And it wasn't exactly the prettiest of games, double-digit loss to Kansas. Now, I think we have to put in perspective here that while Kansas has turned into is a team that is not, 18-8. When was the last time Kansas lost 8 games? And when was the last time we thought of Kansas as really just not that good of a team like we have this season at times? But the Jayhawks are playing phenomenal basketball. The only game they've lost in the last, in over a month was at Texas, and that was only a 3-point loss.
That they should have won and controlled the first half.
Right, that they should have won. So this is a Kansas team that is much closer to the Kansas team we thought we might have after they put up 90 points and really were in that game with Gonzaga to start the season. Much closer to that team than maybe the team that we saw stumble in the middle of their Big 12 schedule, losing 3 Big 12 games in a row, losing to Tennessee by 19. So it's not a bad loss by any stretch of the imagination, but one that Baylor did not have a loss. And they got one and it's not like they were the better team and it was really close and Kansas had the better last 90 seconds of the game. Kansas controlled this game, led at halftime, won the second half by 10, and controlled this game for most of the game, which is something we did not that I did not necessarily expect to see. But let's start there with the Bears. Thoughts on their loss to Kansas, and have your feelings about the Bears changed at all, even if very little?
Yeah, first off, you're absolutely right about Kansas. This is a team that's really, turning into the team we thought they could be, right? They've got more wins over ranked opponents than any other team in the country. 7. They've taken down Texas Tech twice, West Virginia, Creighton, Kentucky, Baylor, Oklahoma State. This is a team that's really impressing right now. They were dominant defensively in this game. When I look at Baylor, there were, of course, warning signs in their first game back from their extensive pause. Their game against Iowa State was, as we talked about on Friday, Josh, was sloppy. It was a game that, is understandable that they were coming back from pause, that they would show some rust, but it was also a game that if they were not playing Iowa State, they would not have won. Or most teams, they would not have won that game. Um, a couple of big picture observations from Baylor before their pause. And again, we're talking about a 2-game sample size back from it. Before their pause, they were shooting nearly 44% from beyond the arc. Since then, in those 2 games, under 28%. It's gone from now again, right, small sample size, but it's gone from an incredible strength to a major liability for this team. They missed 20 of the 26 3-pointers they attempted on their game, in the game in Allen Fieldhouse. You also have, and it's easy to point to that and say, well, it's just, that's very uncharacteristic for Baylor. There's no reason to believe that's going to continue. But it wasn't the only thing that plagued them in this game in particular, because Kansas grabbed nearly half of its offensive rebound opportunities. Kansas got 72% of its defensive rebounding opportunities. So they were winning on the inside. They were, winning the battle on the inside on the boards as well.
Mm-hmm.
My overall take, though, I'll get to that kind of right away here. I'm not panicking about Baylor. I don't want to overreact. And I think that'll be reflected when we get down into our top national title contenders, my picks for that. I don't want to overreact, but it's fair to say that I think some level of concern is warranted, because there's zero doubt that this team is what they're capable of at full strength. But we're so deep into the season at this point that it's fair to wonder when full strength re-enters the picture.
Sure.
Now, it could just re-enter the picture next game. Now, they've got a tough slate of games coming up. They don't get to coast to this. They got West Virginia, Oklahoma State, and Texas Tech to end the season. So they can't afford, they can't just, they need to come to bounce back quickly. And they easily could. They could come back in the very next game and look like the Baylor we expect. And all of a sudden, I'm glad that I didn't overreact. But it's one of those things where you just don't know if they're off and the pause just sort of, rattled them in a way that they couldn't rebound from quickly. We just don't know, since there's only a few games left, how quickly they can get back to where they were. Because if they can't, that's the kind of thing that leads to an upset in the second or third round of the NCAA tournament.
We also need to appreciate what it means for David McCormick to be the best player on Kansas as well.
Sure.
He was incredible and has been really, really good during this stretch where they've also, as we've talked about, really figured out and made some adjustments defensively and have become one of the best defensive teams in the country. That combination, he doesn't look like the same player. He's a completely different player now.
Agreed.
That combination means that this is a completely different Kansas team with a much, much higher ceiling that is much more dangerous.
And so, all of a sudden, a team that has something that really, that if you pick something that Baylor's not especially well equipped to combat, it's the other team's best player being a 6'11" guy.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. So you saw that with his performance, their dominance inside, as you alluded to, Chris. So that part of it, this is a game that you're not shocked anybody loses when Kansas plays that well at home, when David McCormick is playing like he is right now. I'm not overly concerned about Baylor. It takes at least a couple of games usually for teams to get back into the swing of things. So the fact that they shot under 40% from the field, from the 3-point line, and the free throw line, that's not going to be who this team is moving forward. It's almost mathematically impossible for college basketball teams to be that bad in all three areas every game. Mm-hmm. However, here's the problem that Baylor now faces, because there's two different conversations, right? There's where's Baylor when it comes to seeding and the NCAA tournament, the NCAA selection committee's eyes, and where's Baylor when it comes to national title contenders, which we'll get to in a little bit. But Michigan had a bad half. Gonzaga had 0 bad halves coming out of their COVID pauses that were essentially as long as, at least for Michigan, right? Every bit as long as Baylor's. Mm-hmm. And Gonzaga played Iowa and more or less ran them off the floor for large portions of the game, particularly at the beginning. And
scored Michigan 100 points to talk about field goal percentage. Yeah.
Right. Michigan had a terrible half, but then came in and dominated Wisconsin in the second half, top 25 team. I'm
Sure.
not in love with Wisconsin, but that's still a good opponent. Baylor, this is up to 4 halves now. And they have all been bad.
Mm-hmm.
We're getting to the point here where if Michigan runs the table, and we could sort of get into this conversation, or if people have more to add on the Baylor Kansas part, but if Michigan finishes this thing out, wins the Big Ten tournament, I don't see any justification for putting Baylor ahead of Michigan when it comes to seeding. Now, is it all that important at the end of the day? No, because they're probably going to be 2 and 3. So they're going to have to play each other to get to the Final Four and theoretically face Gonzaga anyway. And of course, neutral floor because you're playing, everybody's playing in Indiana. So it doesn't really matter. But from a resume standpoint, you can use, and I am more than willing to use the pause as a justification or an explanation as to why this happened. But when you're comparing these teams resume wise, it cannot be, because Michigan and Gonzaga had the exact same thing that they went through, and they dealt with it much, much better for whatever reason. Like you said, Chris, Baylor just can't shoot the ball right now. They're sloppy. They're not good defensively. All of these things that we have come to expect from them as arguably the best defensive team in the country and the best shooting team in the country, they're just not right now. It could change instantly. But so this doesn't change how I feel about them overall, but how I feel about them within this conversation that continues to get more and more interesting of who I'm putting ahead in terms of seeding. This changes a lot because this is not a specific circumstance to Baylor. Michigan went through this, Gonzaga went through this, and they handled it just fine. So at some point, there's a price to pay for that when it comes to seeding and where you're ranking these teams based on, for Selection Sunday, not necessarily national championship contenders, but that was my big thing coming away from this is you can use it to sort of build whatever vision of or understanding of Baylor you want. But Michigan dealt much, much better with this. And they're in the better conference, and now they have the same record, and both teams had one bad game.
Have my thoughts about Baylor changed yet? No. But we're getting to the point where it's fair to ask, did the COVID pause change Baylor in a way that they're not going to be able to completely fix it? Because we're 4 halves in, and listening to a podcast earlier this week, Scott Drew spent a lot of time talking to other coaches who had gone through long pauses, and a lot of those coaches said it usually takes it took us about 3 games to get back. But to Josh's point, it took Michigan a half. It didn't take Gonzaga any time whatsoever. I think part of that is because Michigan and Gonzaga's offenses, Gonzaga is just so ridiculously overpowered offensively that somebody's probably going to have a good game. And while Baylor's the best 3-point, I'm just not terrified of Baylor's offense. I'm not. In a way that I am about Gonzaga. And so I say that to say the margin of error until we start to feel like they're really struggling you don't have to go over as far for it as a team like Gonzaga would have to. But I think, if they come out the next game, even if it's against a good opponent and they look flat, we're getting, guys, we're a week away from the Big 12 from the Big 12 tournament.
Yeah.
They don't have the luxury of spending a week and a half to get right. I guess from the start of their, right, if Baylor has another bad game, it's not going to impact their Big 12 tournament, at least not yet. But it's a fair question to start asking pretty soon. Is the COVID pause just, I saw an article in which Scott Drew called it their kryptonite. That's not good. Superman wasn't able to overcome his kryptonite, right?
Yeah.
So if you're going to use that word, to a certain extent, it implies that this is going to be really tough, if not impossible, to overcome. And get back to the same point that they were prior. Because it's not a slump. It's a slump that the foundation of it is something that we just never see. We just never see because we've never had a global pandemic to point to. And maybe Baylor's just one of those teams that an almost month-long break, half a month, it was 17 days, 21 days, something like that, 3 weeks. maybe Baylor's just one of those teams that isn't ever going to be ever completely bounce back. That's okay, but there's just no way to know how your team's going to react to that kind of thing until it actually happens. And that isn't scary for Baylor yet, but we're getting pretty close to it being a scary,
Mm-hmm.
you know, a scary reality, right? I mean, and they don't have time for it. It's not like the Big 12 schedule is about to start; it's about to end, and we got Big 12 championship games to fight for, and number one seeds to fight for, and the NCAA tournament and all of that. The other thing I will say, the last thing I have to say is that after everything, and part of this is because Baylor's only played 11 conference games, and Kansas now done with their Big 12 schedule, so it's not like they can do anything to jump Baylor and West Virginia. But after all of this, Kansas is only a game and a half back of first place in the Big 12, which is just, we felt like Kansas was really bad for stretches of this season, and still here they are at the top of, almost at the top of the second best conference in the country. It's impressive the stretch that they've gone on, and beat some really good teams in the process, and find themselves near the top of the Big 12 in a way that I don't think any of us were expecting them to after their slump in the middle of the season.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a Kansas team I'm going to be looking at really closely when it comes to tournament time to see
Yeah.
how they match up, and could I see, because there's definitely plenty of scenarios in which I could see them making a deep run in the tournament. And yeah, as far as, given all that, with all those things that we've talked about with Baylor and the fact that Michigan, right, took down IU very convincingly over the weekend, there's only so much to say. IU is not, Indiana, not on the level of these other teams we've been talking about. They're going to miss the tournament. They're going to miss the NCAA tournament at this point, it looks like. So it's obviously, there's only so much you can take from a game like that. But Michigan, just sort of slowly, even if it's just a small step, it's continuing to affirm my sort of just like I'm all on board with them. Now, only so much can come from a game like this, but it just reinforces how strong this team is when all the pieces fit together the way that they do. I just continue to be so optimistic about the versatility, the various ways they can score, the various ways they can win, how elite they are defensively, how uncomfortable they made the Hoosiers look over the weekend. Obviously, again, Hoosiers not a top tier team in the country, but still, just how uncomfortable they made them look. Just continue to be more and more convinced, and there's just very little to say at this point to sort of pick at Michigan's resume or anything about them at this point. Like the small sample, like there's just we're running out of things for me to even find anything to say. Well, to play devil's advocate, there's just not much material there.
They did exactly what I wanted them to do, and I knew they could, but I wasn't sure they actually would. They followed up that Ohio State game with a dominant win over Iowa, in which Hunter Dickinson got the better of Luka Garza, and they slowed Iowa's offense down, and then took care of IU. Yes, a game that they should win, but also a team that desperately needed that win to try and keep its NCAA tournament hopes alive. Mm-hmm. Right? Mm-hmm. Indiana had everything to play for, and it just wasn't competitive. So the other part of this that's getting very interesting because of the way that Baylor's schedule broke in the games that they missed, as you talked about, Chris, right? They're making up all these games against ranked opponents here at the very end. So right now, according to KenPom, Michigan's schedule is the 16th best in the country. Gonzaga's is 109th and Baylor's is 99th. It's not close. Now, those numbers blew my mind to a certain extent because I feel like that's disrespectful to the Big 12. But also, when you play a minimal amount of conference games and you're getting your Kansas States, TCUs, and Iowa States, you kind of sort of start to understand. So this is going to change once Baylor gets these other three games in there. But that's exactly where I've gotten to as well, Chris, is I wanted to poke holes at Michigan just because I think it's fun and because I wanted them to prove that they are every bit as good as this Baylor team that I fell in love with last year and have just continued to stay on that bandwagon. And there's nothing left to say. There just isn't.
They never have a bad game.
Right.
Ever.
They just had one very, very strange game. And
And at that point, we were considering Minnesota at home to be the second best team in the country, which is, I mean, Minnesota is 13-12 and 6-12 in conference, so it's
they haven't won a game away from home though.
So the point,
to the point.
So I won't take my point back at all.
Right.
But right, so they have that, but it wasn't even. It's just incredible how low their floor is. Michigan's. Mm-hmm. It just never seems like they're gonna score less than 70 points or give up more than 65, and that's a pretty darn good way to win a bunch of basketball games, right? I mean, you've now held Iowa, one of the best offenses in the country, if not the best according to KenPom. I think they're second behind Gonzaga right now. Holding them to 57 points is absolutely ridiculous. And that's exactly what they did. They hold IU to 57 points again. It's they just continue to put up quality performance after quality performance, not just winning these 5 games that they've had, 3 of them against ranked opponents in the Big Ten. They're not just winning these games, they're performing really well in all of these games. And right, like you guys said, we're running out of ways to poke holes in this basketball team. I mean, if you want to poke a hole in their win over Indiana, it was that the bench only gave them 3 points. But then again, who cares when Isaiah Livers has a double-double and Franz Wagner continues to play some of the best basketball he has all season, 21-6, 14 from Mike Smith on 4 or 5 shooting. It doesn't really matter when the starting 5 plays as well as they did. But I got nothing else to say about Michigan. The only thing left to say about Michigan is when we get to Selection Sunday, which number 1 seed are they? And is Baylor still considered the team that is most likely to join Gonzaga in the national championship game? Because it's getting close. And right now all the faith in the world in Baylor still. But it's getting close, and the 2 teams are going in opposite directions right now. And there's the only questions to ask about Michigan now is just how high can they get before Selection Sunday, and where do we where are they in the hierarchy of the sport by the time we get to the first round of the NCAA tournament?
To me, the gap is completely closed. It's a personal preference decision at this point.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
And like you guys have both said, depending on what happens with Baylor over the next week, this might not even be a choice.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Baylor needs to figure out how to not shoot so poorly and go back to being the team that they were, or this is not a discussion.
Yep.
But it's too early to make that kind of determination. So yeah, I thought there was a big gap, and I have been very opposed and reluctant to declare that gap closed, but I have no choice.
Yeah.
The one other thing I'll say about Baylor is that I'm officially worried about their best players in the biggest games and in tough games where things aren't going especially well. Jared Butler had 5 points and 5 fouls against Kansas. There's just I've gotten to the point where I believe in the best players in Gonzaga and Michigan more than I believe in Baylor's best players, which is maybe a little unfair to Baylor, but at the same time, the best players in the biggest moments have been on Gonzaga and Michigan's teams, and especially when games aren't going perfectly. Baylor's guys haven't been as good as I want them to be, and I haven't seen Jared Butler put together a full, really good game against a really good opponent yet this year. He's had some times where he's the best player in the last 4 minutes, and to a certain extent, that's all that really matters if the game is close when at the under 4 timeout of the second half, right? You want your best guy to be the best player on the floor. But against quality teams, you need him to be one of the best players on the floor for longer stretches of time. Some other things happened this weekend. Villanova lost at Butler for the 4th time in 5 years. 73-61. Shouts to the Dogs. Jeremiah Robinson Earl, 16 points, 16 rebounds. But other than that, not a whole lot to write home about for the number 8 Wildcats. Everybody was okay. Nobody was great. They shot 36% from the field. Bulldogs shot 50% from the field. In the Big Ten, 73-57 win for Iowa over Ohio State. How differently are you guys feeling about the Buckeyes compared to a week and a half ago or I guess a week ago, when they went toe-to-toe with Michigan, who we just finished talking about as maybe the second best team in the country officially? The Buckeyes have gone the other direction since then. It hasn't looked pretty. They're now losers of 3 in a row, including a loss to Michigan State. Of course, the other 2 are to top 10 teams. But those 2 losses to the top 10 teams were at home, and they've kind of gone the other direction since that really great game against Michigan. How do you guys feel about the Buckeyes right now?
I'm a little bit concerned. I mean, I feel a little bit different about them. I shouldn't say I'm really concerned. I just feel a little bit different. For me, it was really clear that they were, before this stretch, that they were sort of, like, that's the number 4 team. And it's kind of clear that I feel like they were a little bit ahead. And again, some of it's personal preference, but I feel like they were a little bit ahead of some of those other teams, that other collection of, 3, 4, 5 teams right there below them. Now I'm not really sure that there's a lot of separation. I feel like they're just sort of part of a group of, they're just part of that group. And it's sort of harder for me to say that, to strongly and passionately argue that they belong at the top of that group of tier 2 teams. Now, of course, like, none of the 2 of the 3 losses that they just had, 2 of the 3 of them were not embarrassing. They were not, Michigan and Iowa. Those are nothing to, that are nothing horrible. At Michigan State was obviously rough. Kyle Young has not been himself for them lately in this stretch. He doesn't seem to be at 100% right now. And the one thing I will say for the Buckeyes, for me, that I'm looking for, is it puts so much pressure on their game against Illinois on Saturday, because if they come out and they're just, again, they haven't, been able to, and again, they're not struggling horribly, but I'm really looking at what they do in this upcoming Saturday as a big sort of, like, this is your chance to sort of prove that I shouldn't be, that I'm overreacting, maybe sort of show me that I'm overreacting and that you are clearly, number 4, number 5 in terms of ranking teams. And if they can't show that, if Illinois runs them out of the building, or, Illinois dominates, let's say, and Dosunmu is not back still, and they're able to win convincingly, that's going to be meaningful for me. It's not, now they're, Ohio State is at a point where I'm not going to drop them in my rankings in my head significantly unless something horrible goes wrong. But when it comes to small margins between tier 2 teams, I'm going to need to see something against Illinois. Otherwise, it's really going to be hard for me to make a strong case, that they are separated from those other groups in that tier.
Yeah, I don't have too much to add. This was exactly what we've talked about, that if they followed up that Michigan loss with a bad stretch, then all of a sudden this conversation about the last number 1 seed gets really interesting. Mm-hmm. That's exactly what's happened. It helps that team right behind them, Illinois, also lost to Michigan State.
Yeah, it does.
Spartans took them both out, so they've got that going for them. But
right,
yeah, you got to turn this around pretty quickly. They had so much room to work with in my head that I'm not too worried about it. Mm-hmm. I just think what we've learned is that they are not as good as Michigan.
Not even close.
Right. Yeah. That there is a clear gap between those teams. And so the idea that Ohio State can have a couple bad games in a row and Iowa can really control a game against them and they can get upset by Michigan State. Now, Michigan hasn't played Michigan State yet. They get them at the very end here. But that's to me what we learned. And that's more of a credit to Michigan than a criticism of Ohio State. Mm-hmm. But there's a clear separation between those teams that a week ago I wasn't quite so sure existed to the extent that I now think it does.
I am desperately want somebody other than EJ Liddell, Dwayne Washington, or CJ Walker to score the basketball. Desperately. Yeah. Like, Kyle Young, 3 points. Zed Keys, 0 points. Justin Ahrens, 3 points. Seth Towns, 2 points. Dwayne Washington didn't have a good game in this one, and that's why they only scored 57 points. He only had 7 on 3 of 10 shooting. Right now, I have zero confidence in Ohio State until the nature of their offense changes. And that might be a little bit of an overreaction, but you're not going to beat anybody good if only 3 of your players score with consistency. And it's not like it's not, just give me a consistent 5 points from everybody else. You're not even getting that. And what happens is that when Dwayne Washington Jr., who just by the nature of his confidence and the way he plays, he's going to have some off nights because he doesn't have the greatest shot selection. He just takes a lot of shots with confidence, and if he's on, he's going to score 30. See home game against Michigan where he had 30. But then there are going to be some nights where he's 3 of 10 from the floor, and I'm pretty sure his only 3-pointer and one of his 3 field goals was the one he threw up at the half-court line. I'm pretty sure that was him. I got real concerns about their ability to score night in and night out, unless something changes and they get some more consistent contributions elsewhere. Because players not named E.J. Liddell, Dwayne Washington, Justin Swing, and C.J. Walker had a total of 4 field goals in this game. That's not a coincidence that they only scored 57 points. And you're just not going to beat anybody. And it's not like Iowa had a great game. They were okay. I mean, they were, knocked down 10 3-pointers, 41% from there, but they were only 46% from the field. It's not like they went out and shot 59% and put up 95 and you lost by 20. They put up 73 and you lost by 20 or 16 or whatever. I think ultimately what you said, Josh, is the best way to put it, is that it's just clear that they're not as close to Michigan as maybe we thought they could be after that game in Columbus, which is fine because there are, as we just discussed, very few teams that are up there with Michigan, and Ohio State's not one of them. Coming up next, we'll do 5 national title contenders, and then do winners and losers to close out the show. You're watching 110 Daily on the 110 Sports Network.